Hello everybody and welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. In today's review we're going to be taking a look at yet another release to feature Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor in the 4th and final volume as a part of the critically acclaimed Stranded series. This box set is of course available to purchase now on the Big Finish official website in both physical CD and digital download formats, and can also be purchased as part of a bundle alongside the other Stranded releases. Now, Stranded has been a really interesting series and has taken Doctor Who to brand new territories, and what I've really loved about this series personally for me is that it's kind of followed my university experience throughout the years. Volume 1 was released when I first started uni, and very much like how the last few years has shaped everyone's lives, the production of this series has also changed due to the nature of remote recording within a global pandemic, which I think is very interesting for this series in particular because it's very focused around people and lives, and of course our lives have been affected drastically over the past few years, so in a way I love how the events of this series have been affected by the world around us because it's made for some really interesting listening, which has also captured a unique moment in history. So very much like how I mentioned in my review of Volume 3, basically I started listening to Volume 3 when it was released, and I soon realised that a lot of the plot and narrative knowledge that I should have recalled from Volumes 1 and 2 were no longer in my mind due to being released a whole year or even 2 years prior. So as a result, I went back and listened to the entirety of Stranded again, and now I'm finally at the point to listen to Stranded Volume 4, and that is something that has most certainly benefited my listening experience for this series, and if you are someone who's purchasing Stranded in bulk, I definitely recommend more than anything listening to this series as an overall package rather than waiting a long time between each box set. Having it all in the mind at once is definitely the way to approach this series. So let's take a look at how this box set shapes up. So as always, we do have 4 separate stories, however all of them are interlinked with this plot arc which has taken over this series. I think certainly as the volumes have gone on, the plot arc has naturally become more prominent within this series, so Volume 4 definitely sees all of those loose ends being tied up. So Episode 1 is Cross Lines as written by Matt Fitton, Episode 2 is Get Andy as written by Lisa McMullen, Episode 3 is The Keys of Baker Street as written by Roy Gill, and the concluding episode of Stranded is Best Year Ever as written by John Dorney. So as per usual, we have lots of excellent Big Finish talent basically leading this entire series, as well as some of the highlights of this series returning as well, in particular the likes of Lisa McMullen and Roy Gill, who have produced some of the best episodes within this series, so it's great to see them return for this final set. Time is unravelling and the TARDIS team are on a mission to stop it. The 4th volume of Stranded begins with Crossed Lines as written by Matt Fitton. We pick up from where Volume 3 left off, seeing the TARDIS team return to Earth to update Tanya on what has occurred in a now partially functioning TARDIS. The Doctor, meanwhile, is frustrated as it seems that no matter what he does to try and fix matters, someone new ends up being hurt. From the very start of this story, it's clear that both Liv and Helen are frustrated with the Doctor, but I think this really shows how desperate he is to put things back right. The Doctor takes a trip back through time with Helen, seeing the return of Robin Bright Thompson and the tricky relationship with his father. I know what you're thinking, what could possibly go wrong? I feel like the Doctor is basically trying anything by this point to put the world back on track. He seems incredibly desperate. And indeed, something does go wrong. Helen accidentally bumps into a past version of Tanya from a few months prior, causing Tanya in the present a great deal of pain, as her mind is fluctuating, creating new memories, but in the past. Liv decides in the Doctor's absence that there is only one person who can help whilst time is so vulnerable, and that is a mysterious old man who is always feeding the birds in Trafalgar Square. This time round though, of course, the role of the curator is portrayed by none other than Colin Baker. Of course, previously within the other volumes of Stranded, as well as most notably within the 50th anniversary special, the role was portrayed by the excellent Tom Baker, but it's interesting seeing another person take on the role, and I do love the way that this episode parallels the first volume of this series, also featuring the curator within the opening story. That mysterious uncertainty of the role is also carried into this story, and naturally it allows for Big Finish to bring even more questions to the table. Colin Baker is a great addition to the cast, and I think that he acts the role with that lovely, mysterious yet cryptic personality. I would say that Colin Baker's take on the character is a little bit more involved as compared to Tom Baker's version of the role, but this allows him to have some excellent scenes with Nicola Walker as Liv. And I think that one of the positives of this character overall is generally he has a lot of power and a lot of knowledge, making him absolutely excellent to deliver all of that exposition, especially when you have a plot arc that has gone on now for quite a number of episodes, and it is rather complex, but the character explains it in a way that is very easy for the listener to understand. So it's not one of those plot arcs that is very daunting and overly complex. I think that perhaps the inclusion of the curator within this series will be seen as a negative by some, believing that this character should have only remained within the Day of the Doctor as a one-off mystery. And I think that if you are someone who feels so strongly like that, then perhaps Stranded is not going to be for you, but I definitely think the advantages of this series are certainly worth listening to if generally the curator is the one thing that is putting you off. You can kind of just discard him to the side and focus on all of that positive character development that this series features. As he is also mentioned within the casting credits for this story, and it is rather logical to see him return for a plot perspective, we also have the return of Clive Wood as Mr. Bird, a lovely throwback to Volume 1. This really gives the sense that this series is starting to come full circle. I like the way that the story allows for the Doctor to think about his footprint on the universe, who he inspires, and the consequences of his actions. There is a lovely moment in the later half of this story performed by Paul McGann and Colin Baker as they tell a particular Gallifreyan story, which I think was a really nice way to conclude this episode, as well as intrigue me for what's ahead. Lisa McMullen has been one of the shining lights within the Stranded series, as she is so suited to the domestic human setting, which has been woven throughout the entirety of this series so far. Get Andy picks up from the events within the concluding story of Stranded Volume 3. We see Sergeant Andy Davison in a rather difficult, life-threatening situation, and therefore I think again this is another one of those episodes that benefits from listening to this series in bulk rather than over a long period of time, as this episode very much directly intertwines itself within the events of Volume 3. Get Andy is also another one of those episodes that I think if you don't appreciate and like the characters within this TARDIS team, you probably will find that this episode drags quite a lot. But as I've already mentioned throughout these reviews, I think that if you've got this far through Stranded, you probably do like this TARDIS team, otherwise you wouldn't have listened to this entire series. Helen and Liv are alone in Baker Street, awaiting the Doctor's return, when Andy appears at the door to Baker Street. But how can Andy be back, but also being saved by the Doctor at the same time? Nicola Walker and Hattie Morahan once again deliver some brilliant performances. The episode takes quite a lot of time to dig into these characters' minds and allows Andy to question the role of the companion, and how the Doctor's involvement within that person's life can affect them in ways that are both for the better and for the worse. This series has created lots of great challenges for these companions, but I think Helen in particular shines within this story, as she seems so relatable and troubled by the recent events. Helen struggles when the Doctor is off doing his own thing. He's been quite challenging throughout the entirety of this series, and I think that Helen has often received the brunt of that, especially given that Liv has rather regularly been going off of Tanya and doing relationship stuff. The Doctor is placed in a very difficult situation where his reckless actions have led to his rather imminent demise. Paul McGann is absolutely brilliant again throughout this story. Due to him being alone, there is quite a lot of time spent with 8 interacting with the TARDIS interface and no other characters, but it's the Doctor's desperation which drives the scene forward. He questions what happens after death and dying in the absence of his friends. Again, especially given that this series was produced within the COVID-19 pandemic, there is another level of emotion which I've attached to this story, which definitely made the impact of this episode hit home even more. That whole idea of loss and familiar faces and losing those around you and appreciating those who you share your life with. I think that the writing talents at Big Finish have truly embraced the environment of which this series has been created within, and as opposed to simply trying to strive on and release these box sets in the same structure that they initially planned to, I like the way that the environment of the world of 2020 has physically shaped the narratives that this series is creating, and who knows, if the pandemic didn't happen, this series may have gone in a completely different direction. Paul McGann's performance within this story in particular is really powerful and quite touching. If you are someone who likes to visualise episodes within your mind whilst listening along, I think that this one will definitely be for you. It's also nice that this story decides to dedicate quite a lot of time to Sergeant Andy Davison, because in some of the recent Stranded stories overall, he has started to fade away slightly compared to other characters. He can often be overlooked, but at the same time, Andy is an essential part within this Stranded family. If anything, he is the glue which holds them all together. I discussed this quite a lot when reviewing Volume 3 of this series. Of course, within this story, we do also get further exposure as to the events that have occurred due to divine intervention and the timeline which has been created from that organisation. And I think the interesting thing about divine intervention as a whole concept is it's never really been a mystery, with maybe the exception at the very beginning as to who is actually behind divine intervention as an organisation. It's instead focused on why it exists in the first place and how we can change things for the better, because this timeline is a bit grim. The third episode of the box set is The Keys to Baker Street, and this is essentially a whistle-stop tour of the reoccurring characters within Stranded as a series, taking us back to the style of story as seen within Volume 1, whilst also presenting the higher stakes which shall naturally conclude this series. The Doctor takes the TARDIS back to the 90s in the hope to stop divine intervention from ever happening, and to do this he must look close to home, and into the personal lives of those on Baker Street. A storm is on the horizon and time is unravelling, with time windows opening at various points throughout the Baker Street house as well as its history. But what is the relevance of all of these points within the timeline? This episode is a really personal story which challenges the regulars through seeing and hearing conversations which they were never initially a part of. This episode returns to some of the earlier vulnerabilities within Tanya and Liv's relationship, the reluctance of Robin moving away in order to pursue his father's employment, as well as seeing the aftermath of some of the rather big character revelations within this series, which naturally I've avoided talking about for this entire set of reviews, so these shall remain once more absent within this review, and you'll need to listen in order to find out what those revelations are. I think it's really useful that Roy Gill has written this story, as he has a great way of presenting emotions and character developments in a really natural way. Much like Lisa McMullen, he has been a brilliant strong contributor to this series, so it's lovely seeing him return for its final hurrah. The Curator is also back within this story for the final act only, and it's another great bit of acting from Colin Baker. Again, this Curator is much more hands-on than Tom Baker's take on the character, and I think some may not necessarily like that, but Colin gives the role so much charm and omnipotence. Little bit of a spoiler coming up, we do actually get some interaction between the Curator and the 8th Doctor, which kinda does feel a little bit wrong, but I enjoyed the squabbling between them, so that's okay. Again, I think it is completely down to your personal opinion and what you think of the curator. I think from a context perspective, there is nothing within this box set that does actually explain really why we need another version of the curator, a different iteration of that character. Although I don't particularly mind too much. If anything, it just sparks more mystery with this creation rather than answers. Through returning to Baker Street and seeing the Doctor, Helen, Liv, Andy alongside Tanya, Aisha, Zakia, Robin and Ken gives this series that sense of belonging in a way that I've never quite experienced within a Doctor Who story before. Without a doubt for Liv and Helen in particular, this series has shaped them as people much more than the previous quadrilogies. I must admit, when I went into Stranded, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd listened to Doom Coalition and Ravenous, and I was honestly expecting either Liv Chenka or Helen Sinclair to die at the end of that series, in the hands of the 11 or something like that, because the stakes had been building up and up and up throughout Doom Coalition and Ravenous. For me, it personally felt like we were heading towards the Time War, and then when Stranded was announced, I did feel a little bit odd, a little bit uncertain. I thought, why are we entering this lull when things were kind of hyping up to the Time War? But little did I know, this series has truly shaped this TARDIS team for the better and has made me appreciate them so much more. And I just wish that we got this development a little bit more so within Doom Coalition and Ravenous, and perhaps I may now be able to go back and listen to those series with a little bit more appreciation. I think one of the other reasons why the curator is in this story is to kind of answer the reason as to why Liv and Helen are in the present day, and then you have the Doctor going back to the 90s. So you have this divide within the TARDIS team, and you need a way to kind of bring them all back together again. And I think it does kind of work. This story definitely concludes the timeline aspect of the Stranded series. So this brand new era which has been created by divine intervention and this big grand plan and time unraveling. All that stuff is now done with, and time has been reset, and we are now in the normal 2020 by the end of this story. And as we all sadly know, that real 2020 involved a global pandemic and lots of other grim stuff. So that means we've got a rather interesting and unique Doctor Who story ahead. Best Year Ever concludes the Stranded series. After all this grand adventure, we finally land on the last chapter. Normally, this is the point where the big final story can be an incomprehensible mass of tying up loose ends. Stranded does things differently. It almost feels like Stranded has ended an episode early, and it gives us time to look back on the entire series and reflect. And as I've mentioned within the previous episode of this set, the story concluded with the timeline collapse aspect of the narrative concluding, meaning we have a whole final story to tie up the emotional human aspect of Stranded, being the main protagonists dealing with the real 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic. And oddly, I think that was the way that Stranded as a series should have always come to an end, because this series has always focused on the human dynamics. They've always been at the very core of this series since the very start. It's been interesting seeing COVID actually being presented within the Doctor Who universe. It preserves the oddities that we needed to face as people, from mask wearing, social distancing, limited exercise, eat out to help out, social bubbles, furlough, and the implications of all of those factors placing strain on our lives. I think it's really important to preserve this period of time for what it actually was, rather than placing it in an almost nostalgic lens, seeing it only as a time that we got to spend loads of time inside doing nothing and wondering what the next day was going to be. Instead, it was genuinely, as we all know, a rather unique time within history that placed a lot of mental and physical strain on many different people. Everyone within that time has a different story to tell. It will be really interesting to look back on this story in the future. I suppose in a weird way, looking back, this episode is kind of like a modern take of a pure historical, if that makes sense. People are lost and memories are to be reflected upon, but also decisions for the future must be made. I think if you like stories which see the TARDIS team do more day-to-day activities, this episode is essentially designed for you. It also showcases to me, as a listener, how Stranded has revitalised the 8th Doctor adventures. Through these stories, I've really started to appreciate Liv and Helen as companions. I think personally one of the criticisms that I've had of Liv Chenka and Helen Sinclair in the past is that throughout Doom Coalition and Ravenous, it felt like the plot arc of the series and the grand overall events took prominence over the actual character. Of course, we got to see a lot of time dedicated to the likes of the 11 and the 9, and then arguably even River Song in there as well at a number of occasions throughout Doom Coalition, but I felt like we didn't get too much time to actually sit back and look at the characters that are actually travelling with the Doctor. There is of course the occasional brief moment in there. I think if anything, perhaps looking back on these stories, now having listened to Stranded, it might put the series under a bit of a different lens, but I like the way that Stranded has put the characters first. Conversely to that, also looking forward to the future, I want the events of this series to actually affect the main protagonists moving forward, because one of my big sort of fears is that now we have, at the very end of this story, I think it's no spoiler to say, a fully functioning TARDIS, and once more, space and time is this TARDIS team's oyster. I do not want us to instantly go back to what they were doing before the events of Stranded. I want it to continue to affect the way that these characters act, the way that they approach situations, and judging by perhaps some of the titles which have already been released for these upcoming stories, it's already nice to see that some of those revelations within this series are hopefully going to be addressed in those follow-up stories. Very much like The Keys to Baker Street, this story also celebrates the home for this series, the Baker Street occupiers, for one final time. It's emotional but also makes such a good use of each character. Each person has a nice moment to shine before the end. This series has gave the TARDIS team a family, a sense of responsibility more than ever. It's been a joy seeing that flourish in the audio form. I'm all for Doctor Who stories which raise important questions about world events and politics. It's important that messages are spread to make people think and be aware of the world around them. I do, however, like the way that this story focuses on the people's experiences rather than the political responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, the reactions of the day-to-day humans in that time, and to those close to us in that family unit. Those are the things that I want to remember from that time period, the way that people came together and supported each other, and not the lies, corruption and unpleasantries caused by people in the position of power that occurred during that time. This story also marks the end of the 8th Doctor 4 stories, 4 box sets format, a format which previously I thought was very long-winded and often too complex for its own good, but Stranded has shaped such format into something very special, and I shall be sad to see it end. One of the pros of having a series like this is that there is that clear direction. Experiences change the companions' outlooks, and we get to explore things in much more detail. Although standalone stories are more accessible from a business perspective, I do reserve some concerns that moving forward, some of that sense of direction will be lost. I think this is often a criticism which is directed to the Big Finish monthly range by a lot of Doctor Who fans, that point of stories seemingly not having an overall direction beyond the actual narrative within that release, so you have lots of companions that have stuck around for quite a while, however their plot arc as a companion isn't particularly going anywhere, it's kind of stagnated, which I think is something that definitely occurred to the 6th Doctor era for a while, but some of the best examples of it done really well is in the likes of the recent Mark trilogy, where there was that clear progression with the characters moving forward. Likewise, I think that box sets that have that sense of direction are often ones that, in my personal opinion, always do really well. Those box sets that have a sense of purpose rather than just being a collection of stories. I think that moving forward in the future, I completely understand why Big Finish are perhaps moving away from the format, because let's face it, having a set of quadrilogy stories, which already have a £20 pre-order price tag, let alone in order to fully understand it contextually, you're going to need to spend probably over £200, is not necessarily the best business model. But at the same time, I think there does need to be that fine balance between making stories accessible to people, but at the same time, not sacrificing developments with companions for the sake of making every single box set accessible to those who haven't listened to the previous release within that range. But moving back on to Best Year Ever, I absolutely love the way that this story presents character, and there really isn't too much that I can actually say about this story without revealing too much. I feel like it's just generally a really nice representation of this TARDIS team and the extended protagonists that we've followed throughout the entire era. There are some little curveballs in there as well, which I weren't expecting, some rather sad moments, which kind of highlight again the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as being a celebration of the developments that the series has created for this TARDIS team. And as for the ending itself, I think that it was a really fitting end in a purely Doctor Who way. Stranded concludes on a really poetic note, a very fitting end to a bold Big Finish era, which opened up many new opportunities for this TARDIS team. I love its presentation of time travel going right back to basics, as well as the impact of cause and effect. Yes, it can be timey-wimey at times, but hold on with it, as overall I think it's a very strong set of stories. And who would have knew, an era with very little inclusion of bog-eyed monsters brings out some of Doctor Who's best strengths. So there we have it, that is Doctor Who The Eighth Doctor Adventures Stranded, concluded for one final time. It has been a rather large series of adventures, and one of which that I felt like has stuck with me for quite a number of years, but it is very nice and satisfying to see the end of this series. I think it went on for just long enough to really make it something special. I definitely recommend checking out Stranded if you haven't already, and if you haven't, I hope you found these reviews useful. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for many Big Finish audio drama reviews. If you haven't checked out my earlier Stranded reviews, I definitely recommend doing so in order to get my full picture of this series as an overall package. But of course, as always, have a nice day, and I shall see you all next time.